All right,
Yeah, you can go ahead.
great, great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Coalition Z Maryland for inviting me to participate in the Why It Matters conference. And I'm really excited to talk a little bit about immigration and immigration policy and advocacy, which is sort of my field. Um, and I, so I, my name is Danilo Zak. I'm a policy and advocacy associate with an organization called the National Immigration Forum, which does some advocacy work for immigrants in DC and around the country. And just really quickly, I wanted to give a sense of sort of what I'm hoping to do the next 30 minutes or so, and then hopefully leave some time for questions as well. So first, I want to talk just really quickly about what the National Immigration Forum does and what my work is, so you guys get a sense of where I'm coming from. Then I want to sort of zoom out and talk about immigration policy in general, the US immigration system, why it's broken, why it's important, and sort of some of the things that we can do to fix it, and just giving a little bit more context about the US immigration system and immigration more generally. And then at the very end, I'll speak a little bit about my own sort of personal journey to um, focusing on immigration and how I came to care about it and be passionate about it. And then hopefully I'll leave some time for questions as well. So again, thanks so much to the Coalition Z conference for setting this up, and really excited to talk a little bit more about immigration and why it matters. So first, very quickly about the National Immigration Forum. The forum's a nonpartisan advocacy organization that was founded back in 1982. And we advocate for the value of immigrants and immigration to the country. And we do this really using three main ways, three modalities that we do our advocacy work. The first is policy expertise. So I'm a policy and advocacy associate, and part of that is building expertise on US immigration system, US immigration policy, what the president is doing when it comes to immigration, what academics are thinking, and what the administration is doing, and what Congress is doing as well. So really building expertise on that. And then we also have a communications outreach arm. So we're helping to write op-eds, we're helping to push out papers, we're helping to communicate why immigrants are so important to the country. And then third is the coalition building piece, which I think is really, really important. And that's sort of building support for immigrants and immigration. And we really try to invest in a diverse coalition. And that means people from all different backgrounds, from all different parts of the country. And us, especially at the National Immigration Forum, we're trying to reach out to folks who may not ordinarily be part of the immigration conversation, but who can bring that perspective of why immigrants are so important to them. So maybe they're immigrants themselves, maybe they're people like pastors in a church who have immigrants in their congregation, or maybe they're police chiefs who are trying to, in areas where there are a lot of immigrants, and trying to build support and community safety by supporting the immigrants in their communities. So we really focus on sort of all three of these things, and we bring them together to advocate for immigrants and sound federal immigration policy solutions. All right, so now I want to zoom out a little bit and talk broadly about why immigration matters in the US and around the world. And I think the first thing for me that I think of is this first billet, which is thinking about human rights. So often when we think about human rights and how rights are delivered, we think, oh, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. Maybe think of the French Revolution, the Declaration of Rights and the Citizen back in the 1700s. But what is the reality of those documents is that they really are about giving rights to a select few group of people, people who are members of those states. So citizens of the US are protected by the Constitution. Citizens of France protected by their Declaration of Rights and the Citizen. But after World War II, there was some understanding about how there's something, there's something about humans themselves that deserve to be delivered rights, and not just citizens. So those who are outside of the sovereignty of a particular nation state, but there's something that derived from being human itself that we deserve to protect and uphold. And so when I think about immigration, why it's important, I often think that it's really about protecting and upholding human rights and understanding that human rights aren't just based on where you're born, if you're born in the US or born in another country, but they're based on your fundamental humanity. And so when we protect immigrants, when we uphold immigrants, and we talk about immigration, it's often about um, you know really getting to what human rights means and how we're representing that. And then the next sort of important, I think, piece when it comes to immigration is that immigration is a really important part for making a country a better place and a stronger place. And immigration fuels a more dynamic economy. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but immigration, most academics agree, creates more jobs. Immigrants tend to be more entrepreneurial. They're founding more small businesses, and overall, without a robust immigration system, you end up with sort of a stagnant and declining economy. So immigration is very important for that reason as well. And then I also want to talk briefly about uh, the effects of climate change and why immigration is going to continue to be important over the next several decades, which I think is really important to the younger generations who are thinking a lot about climate change, thinking about their own futures. And when it comes to climate change, I think there's a real direct link to immigration and migration, because as parts of the world and parts of the country become less tenable or the climates change, it's going to cause a lot more migration to happen. There's going to be climate refugees. There's going to be people who are no longer able to live in the areas where they have been living because of climate change. And for that reason, immigration is going to be continuing to be more and more important over the course of the 21st century. And so it's something that I think is really important to start thinking about engaging in now, so that when it becomes a bigger and bigger issue down the road, we're ready for that. We're ready to take in climate refugees when they arrive at our door. We're ready to protect people who are fleeing from wildfires or other natural disasters as a result of climate change. So I really want to make that linkage because I think it's important. And then the next reason why I think immigration is really important and really matters is that the way our current immigration system is set up is extremely outdated and broken, and it's resulting in a less efficient, less dynamic economy. There's a lot of immigrants whose rights aren't being upheld or protected under our current system, and it's just a really difficult system to navigate. And so that's sort of what the forum is all about, is trying to figure out sound bipartisan ways to fix the immigration system and bring it to a place where it's really working for American workers, it's working for American families, and it's working to help immigrants as well. So I want to talk a little bit more then about our current immigration system and what makes it broken. Why is it so outdated? What's not working? And just sort of what makes the US immigration system broken. So here are a lot of the different sort of ways in which the system is not working. First, we can talk about our legal immigration system. So how, people try to immigrate here, whether, there's a lot of different ways you could do so. You could do so because you are married to someone who's a US citizen, you want to immigrate, or maybe you have family member who is a US citizen, or maybe you found a job in the US and you want to immigrate to work in that job. But unfortunately, the system is very dysfunctional. So there are people who have gotten job acceptances in the US. So they have an employer who says that we want to hire you, you're the best person for this job. But because of the way the immigration system works, they won't actually be able to get a green card for 20 years because it's backdated. And the same thing is true for families. There are certain people from certain countries, if you are like a sister, a sibling, or a parent of someone from the Philippines or from Mexico, it could take decades before you could come in through our legal immigration system because it's so oversubscribed. So there are sort of limits to how many people we've set limits to how many people can come in on various visas, and those limits are extremely oversubscribed, and they are not representative of the demand for those visas or sort of what they should be. So that's one of the big problems. And that's the second pillar. So demand for immigrants in general, immigrant labor in particular, vastly exceeds available visas. And part of that is because our immigration system was sort of built in 1965, and it's been really difficult for us to reform it since then. And I'll get more to that. But basically, our system is incredibly outdated, and we've really been unable to effectively reform it to match the current needs of the country. That's why you see all these problems with people who are eligible to come in and have gone through the whole legal process, but they still have to wait another 20 years. So it's a lot of people will say, oh, immigrants can come in, they just need to get in line, they need to do it the legal way. But that's not always possible because our system is so broken. And then I'll also talk quickly about foreign students, other countries. It's really easy. If you're an international student, you can come to the US, you can study, or you could come to the country and study, and then you can get work afterwards really easily if you find a job opportunity. And it's really easy to stay and participate in the economy of that country and really contribute. In the US, it's much more difficult because of our broken immigration system. So international students can come here and study, but then it's not always so easy to stay, even if they have a job offer. There's not a lot of pathways for them to stay. If they have a spouse, that spouse often can't work while they're here. So it's really not encouraging top talent and immigrants from other countries to come and stay here. Instead, it's this kind of weird system where they're allowed to come and study, but then we're not necessarily giving them an opportunity to stay. So we train them and then they leave and go contribute to a country that has more welcoming policies than ours. And then one of the key issues with the US immigration system is the undocumented population. So there's about 11 million people in the US who are undocumented. That's a very large number, way too many to sort of deport all of them. And it's not something, and many of them are contributing to the US, they're paying taxes, they're working jobs, they're our neighbors, they're family members, they're our classmates. So one of the big problems that we're working on is how do we create a system where we can legalize these 11 million people? How can we let them go through a process where they can get green cards, they can become legal, and they can become sort of part, we can treat them the way that they should be valued, because many of them are already working in essential, they're essential workers working on frontline businesses. They're incredibly important to the US economy. Again, they're our neighbors, they're our classmates. So how can we figure out a way to get this undocumented population legalized? That's a really important question. And then, we have a couple other things. There's been some recent restrictions to the asylum system when we offer humanitarian protection to immigrants who are fleeing from their home countries. That's been limited in recent years. We're detaining more immigrants, which is becoming a real problem. And we're spending a lot of money trying to secure the border in increasingly ineffective ways. So those are some of the ways our system is broken. I want to dive a little bit deeper into a couple of them. So first, just a subset of that 11 million undocumented population is Dreamers or DACA recipients, which many of you may know. So Dreamers are immigrants who were brought to the US as children without proper documentation or who overstayed a visa, but have lived in the US their whole lives, often don't know much else other than being from the US. And they're still treated as undocumented individuals. And so there was a program back in 2013, which gave them sort of temporary protection from deportation, gave them access to work authorization, they could go to school, but they're still sort of temporary. It's a temporary solution for these people who really deserve to be, they're Americans and they deserve to be treated as full Americans. And so that's been a real issue. Under the Trump administration, there's an attempt to end the DACA program, which would leave all of these young people at risk for deportation to countries where they'd really never lived and grown up. That effort was blocked by the courts, but there's another federal court challenge looming in Texas. A decision could be made any day. So really what we advocate for is a legislative solution to sort of give Dreamers a permanent status here in the US, access to green cards and eventually becoming citizens, because we think that's what they deserve. Another big problem is that refugee resettlement is at a record low at a time when there are more and more refugees around the world. So there were 26 million refugees in the world at the end of 2019, and the US has been resettling fewer and fewer refugees into the country. So, while there's an historically high number of refugees around the world due to things like climate change and violence in various countries, there's a record low number of them being resettled into the US. and part of that is because of the Trump administration's restrictions to the refugee program and refugee resettlement program. So that's a big concern for us, and we're hopeful that we can help bring more refugees into the country, partially because all the evidence points to them being incredibly effective contributors. They're small business owners or entrepreneurs. They help breathe life into the communities in which they are living in, and all the evidence points to that. So we're hopeful that more refugees can be let in, especially much more than the 15,000, which is a historically low number set by the Trump administration for the coming year. And then just to illustrate sort of how broken this system is, I want to talk about sort of the pathway to getting a green card in this country legally. So like I said, there really isn't much opportunity for many people to quote unquote get in line and immigrate legally because of how complicated and outdated our system is. And this just sort of explains to you, you don't have to sort of read this entire map, but this is sort of the process for getting a green card. If you're trying to quote unquote get in line, it would be somehow via this method. And of course, many people don't have access to immigration lawyers to help them with this. Many people don't speak English, and so it's difficult for them to navigate this system. So just another illustration of how the immigration system is broken. And, like I said, it's been broken for a long time. So really the last major immigration reform legislation or bill was passed in 1965. So we're still kind of working under a system that was created, 50, 60 years ago. And there's been recognition of that from both parties, really broad recognition that we need to change and fix the immigration system. It's really not working for us for a lot of the reasons I already mentioned. But those efforts have largely failed for a variety of reasons. So here we can see a long list of immigration reform efforts that have ultimately failed in the House, in the Senate, and in Congress. So 2001, 2006, there was a really big one in 2013, 2014 that passed the Senate but didn't pass the House. It was bipartisan with 4 Democratic senators and 4 Republican senators supporting it. But so far we haven't seen broad, comprehensive immigration reform in many, many years. So I want to talk just really quickly about more of the current problems that are facing the system, including many that have been implemented under the Trump administration. So first, just talking about asylum. Asylum, again, is for people who are unable to return to their home countries because they've been persecuted on account of their race or their religion, their nationality, membership in a social group, or their political opinion. So it's a very specific group of people who have been persecuted. And in the past, the US, and according to US law, we're obligated to sort of provide protection to those people if they can demonstrate that they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted on account of one of these things. But unfortunately, over the last 4 or so years, and really beyond that, there have been a number of restrictions to the asylum system, meaning many people who deserve protection have not been offered it. And these are people who are often coming from Central America, fleeing gang violence or fleeing persecution of other kinds. And we have been pretty bad about giving adequate protections to these folks. So these are just some of the policies that have been put in place. Metering is a process where we force asylum seekers to wait in Mexico for prolonged periods before they can come in and ask for asylum. Remain in Mexico is sort of the extension of that, where we force people to wait for years in Mexico while their claims are being processed, often in extremely dangerous conditions, which has resulted in equivalent to refugee camps right at our doorstep on the US-Mexico border, which is something that never happened before then. And these other restrictions, I won't go too deep into them, but suffice to say that the asylum system has been extremely restricted over the past 4 years, and especially now during the COVID-19 pandemic and the end of the Trump administration, there's very little of an operational asylum system currently on the US-Mexico border, which is a real problem. It's resulting in a lot of people, including unaccompanied children, pregnant women, being turned away at our borders. And that's something that I personally am focused on in my policy and advocacy efforts. Also, in terms of interior enforcement, we could talk a little bit about some of the changes there recently that have been bad. It used to be that immigrations and customs enforcement would only focus on convicted criminals uh, when they sort of targeted people for deportation, which has its own fraught context that we could discuss. But more recently, under the Trump administration, there's been really an effort to target everyone who's undocumented in the country to be arrested and held in ICE detention facilities and eventually deported. So you can see here that there's fewer and fewer percent of folks who are arrested by ICE are convicted criminals. Instead, they're just trying to get anyone who's undocumented, which has been a real problem, caused a lot of fear in immigrant communities as well. It's also a really big problem in immigration courts, which I won't go too deep into. Again, there are many complicated issues in the immigration system, and I don't want to go too deep into all of them. One thing I do want to talk about really quickly, though, is farm worker reform. And that might not sound super interesting to all of you. And when I first started working on this issue, I didn't quite realize how important it was, but I think it actually provides a really important lens into how immigration reform can happen and what are the different pieces of an immigration reform bill, even a comprehensive one that could really fix our immigration system, that could pass in a bipartisan manner with both Republicans and Democrats supporting it. And that's really what we're looking for to have happen. And it's going to be difficult to pass any immigration legislation without bipartisan support. So I think when you think about farm worker reform, the issue itself may not seem as pressing as maybe protecting asylum seekers, although when you learn about the nation's farm workers, you realize how important they are to the country and how important fixing this part of the immigration system is, and also how it sort of represents how a way in which we can fix the immigration system overall. So I want to talk really quick about that, just to give you guys a sense of how a solution can be built. And this happened just a year and a half ago under the Trump administration in a divided Congress. So first, just talking quickly about undocumented farm workers. There are millions of undocumented farm workers in the US. They make up, a vast majority of all the farm workers working in the US are undocumented. The majority of them have been living in the US for many, many years. Many of them are parents. They have children who are already US citizens. This is sort of representative of that undocumented population that it really doesn't make sense to round up and deport. That's not the answer here. It's not the solution. These are people who we rely on critically. We depend on them for their labor and their work on the farm. And they've been a part of our community for a long time. Like I said, most of them have been living in the US for over 10 years. So the question is, what do we do with this system? How do we fix the system? How do we legalize these farm workers so that they're not living in fear of deportation? How do we fix the system so that we're not reliant on undocumented workers in the future? We can offer, we can have immigrants who are coming in legally and effectively, who can work on our farms. And how can we do this in a way that's bipartisan, that's supported by both Republicans and Democrats? And the answer, at least in 2019, which is a bill that I worked on, something called the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And it really contains the three key aspects of what an immigration bill and what an immigration solution should have. And the first is legalization. So the bill included a path to legalization and permanent residence for all current undocumented ag workers. So first, it provided all undocumented ag workers with a visa, and then for long-term ag workers, it would let them get green cards and eventually citizenship. And the second piece, so legalization is the first piece. Second piece is reform. So we have to reform the legal immigration system so we don't run into this situation where we're overly reliant on an undocumented workforce that isn't offered the same worker rights, is always in fear of being deported by ICE. That's obviously a problem. So first we legalize the current undocumented workers, and we reform the system. So we reform the farm worker visa, which is called H-2A. We expand it to include a lot more folks. Currently, the system, like I've discussed with other parts of the immigration system, is oversubscribed. It's difficult to use. It's difficult for farm workers. It's not available to all farms. So that's why a lot of farms have been reliant on undocumented workers. So you have to fix that system. And then the third part is an enforcement piece. So then we have to make sure that farmers aren't hiring undocumented workers. If they have a legal system that works, and we have all their workers who are undocumented legalized, then we can add that enforcement piece. And that's where we can build some bipartisan support. So you see the quote on the right, Representative Zoe Lofgren, who is the chair of the House Subcommittee on Immigration Citizenship. She's always said, and she's a Democrat, she's always said we support enforcing an immigration system that works. And that I think makes sense to us at the forum too, which is that, when we talk about enforcement, often people think, oh, that means we're trying to deport immigrants who don't deserve to be deported. Instead, they deserve to stay here and get a path to legal status. And that's what we agree with. So first, have this legalization piece. Then we can reform the system so we don't have to rely on undocumented workers. Undocumented workers don't have to come illegally. They can come legally through legal channels. And then we can enforce that system and make sure that that system is working. So that's kind of a microcosm, I think, of how broad immigration reform can happen. A legalization piece, legalize the workers who are, legalize the undocumented people who are here. Reform piece, change the legal immigration system so that we don't have to, undocumented people who would be coming illegally can now come through legal channels because the system has been fixed. And then enforcement. And that's that third step, where once we have a system that works, we can enforce it. All right, I will skip, for lack of time, some of the sort of 2021 priorities that we have. We are really hopeful with a new Biden administration, the Democrats in charge of the Senate and the House, that there's an opportunity for more immigration reform. The Trump administration in particular, Republicans in general have been supportive of immigration, but the Trump administration in particular was not. So we're hopeful to see a lot of changes across a whole number of topics. And the Biden administration has promised some of those things. And then I just really quickly, I think I'm close to the end of my time, but I really quickly want to talk about sort of my journey to the immigration space. So it really started when I was in college. I wish I had been more engaged in high school in these issues, but I was not. It really started in college. I went to Yale and I was working with, in New Haven, Connecticut, where there's a big refugee resettlement center called IRIS. And I just did some volunteer work with them. And I was working with, young adult refugees in the area, helping them with job applications, helping them sort of adjust to the US, playing pickup soccer with them. And it was that personal experience which sort of brought me to the refugee policy issue. And I studied that when I was in school. I ended up going to get a master's degree in refugee and forced migration studies. And, then I really started focusing on it as my career and my passion. So I think that's really how I became so passionate about this issue, was just my personal experience with immigrants and refugees in the community in which I was living. And I think that's true of so many young people, is that they are brought to issues by their experiences with those around them who are suffering or who are in trouble, or who have stories that who have important stories that you want to hear more about and you want to learn more about and get engaged in. And so that's sort of what brought me to the immigration space, was working with refugees in Connecticut. And that is all I have. Thank you for listening a little bit, and I'd welcome any questions.
Okay, great. We have a couple of them for you. So you mentioned the Biden administration. What things are you willing to compromise on, and what things are you really pushing for?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think a lot of it's going to depend on Biden's own priorities. I think one thing, and whether there's really an atmosphere for comprehensive immigration reform, what a lot of advocates and people involved in immigration policy, like myself, are looking at is there an opportunity for a huge comprehensive fix to the immigration system where we can address all the problems that I mentioned, or is that going to be too difficult? And do we want to focus in on, maybe we want to compromise and say, okay, we want to fix the most important, most pressing matters. Do we want to provide a solution for dreamers? That's what we need to focus on and get done. Or we want to make sure that the asylum system is back to being functional. That's our first priority. So I think when it comes to the Biden administration, the compromise might be, how do we prioritize all these different issues that are affecting all these immigrant communities and what's most important for us to get done. And I think that's the way the Biden administration might be thinking about it as well, because everyone's a little concerned that bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform might be too difficult to get passed, and it's been tried so many times. So maybe the compromise has to be, let's focus on getting Dreamers, a solution, a permanent legislative solution. And maybe we can add in, let's get essential workers legalized, right? In this period of COVID-19, where there's been a lot of support for essential workers, let's get that population of undocumented folks a legal solution. Let's get Dreamers a solution. And maybe we can wait a little bit before we try to go for this broad comprehensive reform to all of the immigration system. So I think that's kind of where the conversation is. That's what people are thinking about. And for us, it really has been, the Dreamer issue, I think, is top of mind for so many people. And that has to be the first priority, I think, as well as rolling back some of the really, terrible restrictions that have been put in place under the Trump administration recently to the asylum system, for example.
So, are there any specific policies that have made it harder for people who were in the process of getting citizenship during the Trump administration? Has it made it hard? Are there any specific policies that made it harder?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, there have been a lot of policies in a variety of different areas that have made it more difficult. I'll give students as an example. So, international students who are sort of come to the US and are in the process of, many of them are hoping to stay in the US long term and work and gain citizenship, gain a green card, and live here permanently. But the Trump administration has made it more difficult to access H-1B visas, which is a way that students who are graduating can get on like a temporary work visa and then eventually become permanent residents. So when it's really difficult to access H-1Bs, it makes it difficult for those students to stay at all after they graduate. So that's one way, sort of restricting H-1B visas for international students and others who are sort of more high skilled workers has been really problematic. And then there's another difficult part of the immigration system, which is that there's something called per country caps for some of these visas. So certain countries can only let a certain number of people from that country access green cards, is the way the US immigration system works. And the problem is that, when you have the same number of visas available for Iceland as you do for a country like India, which tends to send a lot of immigrants, and Iceland, obviously, it's such a small country, it doesn't send many. The result is that certain populations bear the brunt of the wait time. So like an Indian who's trying to get a certain kind of visa might take 25 years longer than someone from a different country. And the result is that it results in a really inefficient and badly structured and unfair immigration system. So that's something that Trump administration has not been eager to fix, and it's something that administration could fix, I think, a little bit more easily. And it also could be done via legislation. But unfortunately, that wasn't able to get done, partially because the Trump administration was not supportive of that kind of legislative solution. But that's just one example. I mean, the Trump administration has been pretty restrictionist towards immigrants across a whole number of different categories.
For our last question, what are ways that naturalized citizens, specifically grassroots organizers, can help immigrants seeking citizenship?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a lot of different ways. I think for grassroots folks, first of all, you can get involved in your local. So often there are a lot of local nonprofits. Sometimes they're church-based, sometimes they're just immigrant advocacy organizations who are helping citizens pass, or it's helping immigrants pass citizenship tests, helping them apply. It's called naturalization, is what the citizenship process is. So helping them apply for naturalization. And so if you sort of go and find the local nonprofit that's helping immigrants in your community, you can ask them how you can volunteer. And that's something that's really easy to do. Just Google naturalization, volunteer, and your area, and you can help in a grassroots manner that way. You can also make your voice heard when it comes to immigration policy and making it easier for folks to become naturalized or to become legalized. And the best way to do that is by calling your representative or your senator or emailing them. And I think a lot of times people don't realize how easy that is to do and how important it is. So often as a policy and advocacy associate, I'm working with members of Congress and their staffs on the Hill. And I'll be talking to them about various issues, trying to support and advocate for immigrants. And often they'll say, do any of my constituents care about this? Like, is there someone in my area who cares about this issue? Or they'll say, oh, I've heard about this issue because someone called and that was documented. So sometimes we think, oh, one person calling, that won't make a difference. But it really does make a difference if you reach out and take, 30 seconds, a minute to call your representative, contact your representative and say, hey, I care about this issue. And I think, we should let immigrants have an easier access to naturalization, or we think dreamers should be legalized. That's a really important part of the process, and it will make an impact on that member of Congress's support for those kinds of solutions.
Well, thank you for joining our conference. Have a great rest of your day.